Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is Reading the Victorian Novel. I'm thrilled today to be presenting installment 15, chapters 44 to 46. The topics that I will be covering today include the chapter titles, whether David is a romantic hero. I'll look at an allusion. I'll discuss some biography, looking at Dickens and oysters. I'll investigate the phrase child wife as it relates to Dora. I'll briefly mention the Telegraph and the history of the Telegraph. Then I'll look a little bit at the plot line of Mr. Dick and how he triangulates the resolution of Annie's subplot. We'll look at Annie speaking out, the grand tour, a brief bit on Victorian underwear, cliffhangers, and we'll conclude with the illustrations. So where I want to start is that David is no longer a romantic hero. So this is the start of chapter 44. It seems such an extraordinary thing to have Dora always there. It was so unaccountable not to be obliged to go out to see her, not to have any occasion to be tormenting myself about her, not to have to write to her, not to be scheming and devising opportunities of being alone with her. Sometimes of an evening when I looked up from my writing and saw her seated opposite, I would lean back in my chair and think how queer it was that all there we were, alone, together as a matter of course. Nobody's business anymore. All the romance of our engagement put away upon a shelf to rust. No one to please but one another to please for life. It was such a wonderful thing at first to have her coming softly down to talk to me as I ate my supper. It was such a stupendous thing to know for certain that she put her hair in papers. It was altogether such an astonishing event to see her do it. So what I want to suggest here is that David actually was obsessed with this first part. David liked the obligation to see her. He liked the occasion to torment himself. He liked writing to her, and he liked to scheme and devise. These are the things that made his obsession with Dora worthwhile for him. He liked those narrative tropes that he was following. And now he realizes that the romance of our engagement was put away upon a shelf, to rust. So you can actually keep romance alive in a marriage, but in this position that we find ourselves in, that's not happening. And then notice this anaphora. It was such an astonishing event, right? That repetition at this point is actually a negation. David is saying it's not, because what it does is it has destroyed some of that romance. Notice those excessive adjectives. Wonderful thing, stupendous thing, astonishing event. And what is it focused around? Finding out that his obsession with her hair was not natural. She actually has unnatural curly hair. But the most important part of this is what I have bolded here, at first. David is implying that there is a change that happens afterward, and it's not for the positive for David. We have an allusion, a very striking one, that Dora uses when she feels that David is potentially critiquing her. She says, "No, no, please," cried Dora with a kiss. "Don't be a naughty Bluebeard. Don't be serious." So this reference to Bluebeard is a reference to the story of Bluebeard, who was a king or prince, depending on the story, and he married a woman, and then he killed the woman, and he would pile the dead bodies up in a hidden chamber, and then he would marry a new woman. He would say, "Don't go in this chamber," and the woman would go into the chamber, and then he would kill the woman. And so it's a seemingly innocuous allusion, but as I want to suggest, it actually implies a lot of the fear Dora has about what kind of husband David is. And I think in this chapter, we see a lot of Dora trying to do what she can to make this relationship, this marriage, be as comfortable to her as it can be. Betsy offers a piece of advice to David that fits into some of these issues. "These are early days, Trot," she pursued, "and Rome was not built in a day nor in a year. You have chosen freely for yourself." A cloud passed over her face for a moment, I thought. "And you have chosen a very pretty and a very affectionate creature. It will be your duty, and it will be your pleasure too. Of course, I know that. I am not delivering a lecture. to estimate her as you chose her by the qualities she has and not by the qualities she may not have. The latter you must develop in her if you can, and if you cannot, child, here my aunt rubbed her nose, you must just accustom yourself to do without them. But remember, my dear, your future is between you two. No one can assist you. You are to work it out for yourselves. This is marriage, Trot, and heaven bless you both in it. For a pair of babes in the wood you are. So I've bolded the section that I think is really important here, where Betsy says, David, you need to accept Dora for who she is, right? Realize the reality of this relationship. A little bit on the biography. So Dora and David, they host a dinner party with Traddles, and it is rather a disaster. One of the things that doesn't work out is the oysters. Do you know, Copperfield, said Traddles, cheerfully examining the dish, I think it is in consequence. They are capital oysters, but I think it is in consequence of their never having been opened. So Dickens was obsessed with oysters. And after he wrote Barnaby Rudge, right, back in the 40s, he actually went to America and he met there the president of Greek, or not the president, he was later a president of Harvard, but he met the professor of Greek, Cornelius Felton, and they maintained a long-running correspondence. In this correspondence, there were many allusions to oysters. And in this particular letter, on the 21st of May, 1842, Dickens wrote, a terrible idea occurred to me. The oyster sellers, what do they do when oysters are not in season? Is pickled salmon vended there? Do they sell crabs, shrimps, winkles, herrings? The oyster set openers, what do? Do they commit suicide in despair or wrench open tight drawers and cupboards and hermetically sealed bottles for practice? Perhaps they are dentists out of the oyster season. Who knows? So it's a frivolous joke. It has to do, though, with jokes at the expense of death by suicide. However, an important thing always to remember about oysters is, one, there can sometimes be pearls inside of them, and two, there's secrets inside of them, like shut up tight as an oyster. That's a simile that we'll give in Bleak House, a later novel. David continues to infantilize Dora in this section. This is also at the dinner party. By and by, she made tea for us, which it was so pretty to see her do, as if she was busying herself with a set of dolls' tea things, that I was not particular about the quality of the beverage. Right, the second part of this clause implying that the tea was rather disgusting, but the first part being like Dora is playing at dolls, a way in which we simultaneously insult Dora and then further insult Dora while making it seem light and frivolous. This is a technique David uses a lot, which I think is really emotionally abusive towards Dora. The most important part of this chapter, though, is Dora's declaration that she wants David to call her by a new name. Will you call me a name I want you to call me? Inquired Dora without moving. What is it? I asked with a smile. It's a stupid name, she said, shaking her curls for a moment. Child wife. I laughingly asked my child wife what her fancy was in desiring to be so called. She answered without moving, otherwise than as the arm I twined about her may have brought her blue eyes nearer to me. I don't mean, you silly fellow, that you should use the name instead of Dora. I only mean that you should think of me that way. When you are going to be angry with me, say to yourself, it's only my child wife. When I am very disappointing, say, I knew a long time ago that she would make but a child wife. When you miss what I should like to be and I think can never be, say, still, my foolish child wife loves me, for indeed I do. What we see here, and I think this is really, really important, is we see Dora's self-awareness and the fact that she knows David is disappointed with who she is. David loved being the romantic hero, doing all those things that made him uncomfortable in the pursuit of love. Dora now recognizes that David is unlikely to change. And so she says this thing to accommodate David and to make the marriage acceptable to her. Notice, in the midst of this, she's trying to have a serious conversation without moving, right? David laughs and then tries to bring her close for like a kiss or for a distraction, and she's trying to have a serious conversation. And she knows David might be angry with her. This is a thing that doesn't get enough attention. David's potential anger, his potential wrath that could make a marriage incredibly uncomfortable. And we see this a little bit in the very strange kind of like peculiar sitcom of the servants that steal things, etc. Like David in these chapters of early marriage is deeply, deeply discontented. And Dora is trying to make things as pleasant as possible for her because, and this is, I think, a really important point, David is almost on the path of being a Murdstone, and Dora is trying to survive in a way that Clara was unable to. We have a brief allusion to the Telegraph. This happens in chapter 45 from Mr. Dick. "Not a word, boy," he pursued in a whisper. "Leave it all the blame with Dick, simple Dick, mad Dick. I have been thinking, sir, for some time that I was getting it, and now I have got it. After what you have said to me, I am sure I have got it all right." Not another word did Mr. Dick utter on the subject, but he made a very telegraph of himself for the next half hour, to the great disturbance of my aunt's mind, to enjoin inviolable secrecy on me. So this installment comes out in July of 1850. And in 1850, there was a huge attention placed on the first telegraph that would be transoceanic. And it was going to cross from London to France. So here in this image, we have the ship Goliath laying the 1850 cable. Why we know this was on Dickens's mind is in Household Words, he was publishing articles about it. So in the current events supplement of January 1850, he writes that the plan of a submarine electric telegraph between England and France is about to be proceeded with. And then actually at the after Copperfield in September of 1850, it was successfully laid. The telegraph and the laying of the telegraph is astonishing. The most interesting part, I think, is when they laid the transatlantic telegraph, because they started in North America and they started in Britain and they met in the middle. That first transatlantic telegraph only worked for a little bit, but still it was absolutely a monumental achievement in communication. Dickens even wrote a piece after Copperfield on December 7th, right after Copperfield finished, called Wings of Wire, a pretty astonishing journal article that he wrote about the kind of optimism around it. So if we look at the bottom part of this, the electric telegraph is one of the most useful pieces of new human ingenuity that's lately been completed. The new Dorado itself, with its plethora of yellow wealth, judged by the standard of what great services may come of it, cannot be more valuable than the strange machine that enables one side of the country to speak with another, regardless of the intervening hundreds of miles of hills, streams, and plains, solitudes, and cities. So that one brief mention from Mr. Dick is actually a reference to all of the fervent excitement around new telegraph communications that's happening in the 1850s. In this section, Dick acts to close down the tedious Malden plot by triangulating Annie and Dr. Strong. That, in the same moment, we saw Mrs. Strong glide in, pale and trembling, that Mr. Dick supported her on his arm, that he laid his other hand upon the doctor's arm, causing him to look up with an abstracted air. And we actually see this in the illustration, as I'll talk about later on. But this plot, as annoying as it has been a parallel plot to that fallen woman idea of the potential for like discord to happen in a family because of a woman's infidelity. Notice the pressure is on the woman in this case. Annie, though, gloriously speaks out. "Our future peace," she said, "may be in your hands. I trust it confidently to your not suppressing anything. I know beforehand that nothing you or anyone can tell me will show my husband's noble heart in any other light than one. Howsoever it may seem to you to touch me, disregard that. I will speak for myself before him and before God afterwards." This phrase, "I will speak for myself," is one that we as readers have been waiting for a woman finally to speak up and not have just all these men talking. You'll remember in the previous installment, all of Uriah's machinating that was happening, and only after people had left did David slap him. But we've finally resolved this because the character Annie finally talks for herself. Annie also has several lines that Dickens is very, very taken with, so much so that he repeats them frequently and then also puts them in his working notes. And the lines are as follows. It was at that time that Mama was most solicitous about my cousin Malden. I had liked him, she spoke softly, but without any hesitation, very much. We had been little lovers once. If circumstances had not happened otherwise, I might have come to persuade myself that I really loved him and might have married him and been most wretched. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. I pondered on these words, even while I studiously attended to what followed, as if they had some particular interest or some strange application that I could not divine. There can be no disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. No disparity in marriage like unsuitability of mind and purpose. Of course, this refers to David and Dora, even though he pretends that he has no idea, he cannot divine why he's fixated on these lines. Here is the working notes section where we see Dickens repeating these lines so that he can remember them later. I also want you to note that early on, he says in this installment, he wants to carry through the incapacity of Dora, but affectionate. Here, I think, is something that we have that's very interesting, where authorial intention is to make Dora seem incapable, but what actually happens when we closely attend to the text is, as I said, Dora being very capable. She's trying to accommodate David, though, because he is so unaccommodating. So I think this is a really great instance where we have an actual authorial statement, but the text belies that desire. We also hear about what's happening with Emily. So Emily and Steerforth are no longer together because Steerforth has abandoned her in Naples, and Litimer gives this following report. Mr. James and myself have been abroad with the young woman ever since she left Yarmouth under Mr. James's protection. We have been in a variety of places and seen a deal of foreign country. We have been in France, Switzerland, Italy, in fact, almost all parts, right? So a little bit of comedy there, defining all of Europe by only 3 countries, but the 3 he lists are part of what is called the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour is an 18th century remnant of very upper middle, but really kind of the upper class, where you tour throughout Europe, visiting museums, sites, cities that are supposed to make you better well-rounded. It's a mode of leisure, though, that is not available to most people. What we see here is a map from Wikipedia, William Beckford's 1780 and 81 Grand Tour. And you will see here that they don't go to France, but so we would have France, they do, France, Switzerland, and down to Italy. The most famous example of this in literature, a famous example of this in literature is Frankenstein, which Mary Shelley wrote while in the midst of her own Grand Tour. But of course, she also sends Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster on their own little mini Grand Tour. So this might be a stretch, but it's a good excuse to talk about Victorian underwear, a question that I think naturally arises in an age that is so far distant from our own. Dickens doesn't talk about underwear, doesn't talk about corsets, doesn't really talk about women's fashion, but I think there's one line here that gives us a brief hint toward it. In this passage, Copperfield is in Peggotty's apartment, and he sees him laying out the following garments in hope of finding Emily. Without appearing to observe what he was doing, I saw how carefully he adjusted the little room, put a candle ready and the means of lighting it, arranged the bed, and finally took out of a drawer one of her dresses. I remember to have seen her wear it, neatly folded with some other garments, and a bonnet which he placed upon a chair. So I think this kind of parenthesis of ambiguity, neatly folded with some other garments, is a reference to Victorian underwear. I gather further evidence because it's taken out of a drawer, and drawers were the slang for underwear. So the way in which a woman's underwear worked was something called open drawers. You see this example here from Wikipedia, right? It looks like a pair of shorts, but it's opened in the back and in the front. Over this, someone would wear a chemise. Over that, a corset. So you can see how you would just pull the dress and chemise up, and you would have access to bowel movements. The installment ends in a rather worrisome way, a bit of like almost male stalking, but it also ends on a cliffhanger. This is David and Peggotty with the we. We crossed the road and were pressing on towards her, Martha, when it occurred to me that she might be more disposed to feel a woman's interest in the lost girl if we spoke to her in a quieter place, aloof from the crowd. and where we should be less observed. I advised my companion, therefore, that we should not address her yet, but follow her, consulting in this likewise an indistinct desire I had to know where she went. He acquiescing, we followed at a distance, never losing sight of her, but never caring to come very near, as she frequently looked about. Once she stopped to listen to a band of music, and then we stopped too. She went on a long way, still we went on. It was evident from the manner in which she held her course that she was going to some fixed destination. And this, and her keeping in the busy streets, and I suppose the strange fascination in the secrecy and mystery of so following anyone, made me adhere to my first purpose. At length, she turned into a dull, dark street, where the noise and crowd were lost. And I said, we may speak to her now, and mending our pace, we went after her. Notice this is two men following a woman in increasingly dark alleys. There's something very worrisome and dangerous here, but David is obsessed with it, right? He's strangely fascinated with this act of following, again, revealing part of David's darker side. So let's turn briefly to the illustrations. This is from our housekeeping, and we see Traddles, David, and Dora. There's the books in the back show a certain amount of messiness on David's part, but notice a lot of the objects that are strewn about, the umbrella, the gyp's pagoda, the guitar, these all, the spilled sewing kit, there you can see the ball of yarn unspooling. These have to do with Dora, but a really important element here is the hat on the guitar. David has put that there. David is encouraging this kind of behavior. So his face expresses frustration. Dora is not really making eye contact with anybody. Gyp is on the table kind of in the middle as David cuts this meal. So in this illustration, I think it's meant for us to critique Dora, but there's these subtler elements that add to it also being a critique of David, who's just as responsible for this mess. One particular element of that responsibility on David's part has to do with this jar of pickles on the shelf. The pickles, I think, are a reference to Miss Murdstone from way back in chapter 10. The boy will be idle there, said Miss Murdstone, looking into a pickle jar. And idleness is the root of all evil, but to be sure, he would be idle here or anywhere, in my opinion. Humph, said Miss Murdstone, still keeping her eye on the pickles. It is of more importance than anything else. It is of paramount importance that my brother should not be disturbed or made uncomfortable. I suppose I had better say yes. I thanked her, without making any demonstration of joy, lest it should induce her to withdraw her assent. Nor could I help thinking this a prudent course, since she looked at me out of the pickle jar with as great an access of sourness as if her black eyes has absorbed its contents. So this pickle jar is another way in which we're alluding to the past, to Clara and Murdstone's marriage. It also gives us that reference to the sourness, to the pickling nature of this marriage. A really important detail, and this is noted on the Victorian website of these elements, is the spilled box. So back in chapter 8, we saw that Clara had her spilled work box, and now we have Dora with hers. So those of you that are tracking all of the ways in which David has essentially married her mother have yet another piece of evidence, this time provided to us from Fizz, as this is not in the text. And the last illustration, this shows that triangulation that I looked at before. Here we have a window bringing some light in. David is in a doorway, right? There's a lot of David in doorways type thing. This is a much neater room that we can tell. Briefly to turn back to the previous slides, though, I wanted to make sure I noted there's a bird cage up here, and we also see lots of Dora's music notes, right? She's no longer tra-la-lying. And with that, oh, I also think it's important, Dr. Strong here has his eyeglasses, but he's making eye contact with Annie. There's this clear sense of communication happening there, which we do not see at all between David and Dora. And with that, we bring ourselves to a close and an end of this installment.